Hi, everybody. So my name is Eduardo Sajgalik, and here I live in Montreal, Canada, and I'm interested in all things community development, growth, strategy. As is normal for anything community-based, I'm going to say hi to YouTube first, because I know this is getting recorded. But this presentation essentially came about because I was trying to answer to myself a difficult question, which is how do games get found today? And I kind of wanted to start with this question. How would a player describe the game I'm making to a friend of theirs? The story I have for this here is initially, it's Nier Automata. Essentially, it was a game that got a lot of publicity when it was released because it's a AAA title, so usually those get a lot of marketing dollars behind them. But none of that made me buy that game. What made me buy the game in the end was because a friend of mine wrote about an 1,000-word tirade on why it was one of the best games ever made and why they fell in love with the title. And it was that love that somebody wrote that made me purchase the game in the end. It's because I had somebody I knew that really endorsed the game that I bought it. And these interactions happen all the time. Secretly, on private messages, in all platforms, people are recommending games to their friends. And all of that has a huge, huge impact on games, and it's how games get discovered. Steam last year had a little less than 10,000 games, so why should anybody play yours? Well, it's because a friend of them told them to do so. Now, this presentation is also going to look at this through game design. The challenge was, what are the best ways to grow a community? And from experience in the industry, coming from a marketing background, the best stuff was still in-game. So we're really going to look at how in-game you can essentially improve the chances of growing your community. So in the presentation, you're going to see how you can design your game to encourage the creation of content by users. We're going to look at how to improve the user experience for spectators, people that are watching Let's Plays on YouTube, for example. And then how you can use your game development skills to aid community development. Keep in mind, you still need to get players to start with. You can design the best game in the world. If no one's playing it, that's not going to help. Your game also needs a core message and vision. Without a core message or vision, it's really hard for someone to describe your game. If that happens, your game is going to eventually fall by the wayside. And also, anything you learn here, I strongly recommend you have community expertise somewhere in your team, or somebody dedicated to talking to your players, because otherwise, again, all this design falls by the wayside. The first part, which is going to be the longest by far, is on content. So it's taking the principle that the people that are playing your game they're playing your game because they love the experience you're presenting. So at that point, you have to give your fans the tools to do so. One example of this that you could use is making sure that there's a way to make it easy to record video content. You can just use the print screen function. Like, make sure that these things are coded in. Also, the second part here, the changing the pace of play to aid image, video, GIF capture. It could be something as simple as something they use in cinema, right? Like just having a wide-angle shot of an area tells the player something big is coming. So it already puts in their mind to start recording, to start taking a picture, a video. A good example of this in the presentation is usually with presentations like this, people think already to start taking notes. So I'm going to preempt that by telling you that this presentation is available on my website and you don't have to take photos of specific slides, just on elements that you find important. The example I wanted to highlight here is a Metroidvania called Icy. There's a ton of Metroidvanias, so this is more about what specifically happens here. In Icy, early on in the game, there's this area called the Totally Empty Room. It literally promises on that. There is nothing to do in that room. However, if you stay long enough in it, the narrator starts toying with the player. They start directly going from the character Icy to talking to the player as breaking the fourth wall. And depending how long you stay, varies your experience. As a result of that, if you go at the time this game was closer to release, if you went on YouTube, by far the highest volume of content for this game was the Totally Empty Room. because it's the one moment in the game where people playing it are like, wait, what's going on? So that's when they actually stopped and went to wonder. That's when they did research on the game, and that's what can lead to deeper engagement, moments like these. Now, you then have to think, is your game actually going towards a macro community? For example, are you designing a game that's good to speedrun? Are you designing a game with deeper engagement that will have people create Tumblr or Pinterest fan groups? Although with Tumblr, that might be a little worse these days because of their policies. And then, sandbox enthusiasts. If you're designing a game where things are built, then you're going to attract people who love to, have that experience building custom content. Two examples I wanted to use here. Mark of the Ninja was definitely a very technical game to play and was definitely designed with speedrunners in mind. They got featured in Games Done Quick, Awesome Games Done Quick, a few times. To give you an example of the exposure, Awesome Games Done Quick gets 100,000 concurrent viewers. And they got that marketing essentially because their game was appealing to speedrunners. The second picture I love, by the way. That's from Dream Daddy Simulator. But again, it's a dating game about dating dads. But that type of game tends to create a lot of additional content, such as this one. And that can lead to longer-term engagement, players that really deeply want to, keep creating content around your game. Okay, so this one's a little, I don't recommend this one for everybody. It's about content creation. The reason I don't is because having a way to, for example, create levels or custom creations has a heavy development cost. So this is really for people who are already considering something like a level editor. But if you are, you need to ensure that there is a form of curation, a way for users to rate the creation of others. You need to make sure that the files are super easy to share, ideally in-game and out-of-game if you can, just because Discord communities pop up all the time, so if the file can be extracted and reused by other people, that's actually pretty good. And you can also create templates for players to use for their hubs. For example, if it's a level editor, you can have an HTML template with the code that says, come play my level at this area. Because by giving a template as well, it's encouraging players to share your content, but doing so in a way that's fulfilling the needs of your brand. This example will get updated once the second one comes out, but I wanted to look at Super Mario Maker quickly. Things to look at for here that were done well. The content ID, unfortunately, is a relic from Nintendo. But what I like about this is that you can see the clear rate, so how difficult the level is, how many people have played versus how many people have favored. So you already know that at 20%, this is a pretty popular level. You can see the user. You can download it and play it right away. So there's an immediacy to it. There's a curation aspect to it. You understand what's going on. And you can see the comments if you needed more information as well. And I mean, nobody can really talk about sandbox games without Minecraft. I think Minecraft was just one of the more revolutionary games of the last, 4 decades, 5 decades, let's say the history of video games. Because it also allowed users to create their own servers and sub-communities. And people can feel at home as a result. I mean, if you really wanted this to live in that world, you could. But I think that's one of the powers of that game, is the ability to be able to create these places where people can feel relaxed and at ease, although the game has so many users. This is probably the second longest slide on events. So to kind of go through it, basically, it's about creating an event plan. You can relook at the details later. The thing to remember from this is that events are kind of in the games as a service perspective, but even if you have a premium single-player title, you want to create a reason for players to come back, if not day after day, at least from time to time. You want to create a reason for someone to try the game every week, because there's a lot of games, there's a lot of entertainment out there, so you still want to give a reason for the player to come back that is unique and that is on schedule. Ways to do that is to have, for example, date-specific Easter eggs. So like on a specific day, something will happen. You can create modified rule sets that players can try for a few days. The examples here are, for example, Moon Gravity or Double Speed, but a game that is an excellent example of that is Slay the Spire. Slay the Spire specifically procedurally generates, I believe, every day a different rule set. So that way, every day you log in, you have a different challenge and leaderboard to have access to. And it's a way to create content so people want to come back every day. But you don't have to. It just encourages players to do so. Other examples are to either increase rewards for over a set period of time, say the holidays, or run content creation contests. If you want an example as to how relevant events can be, one of the games I worked on didn't have an in-game events calendar. We worked on changing that, and the revenue increased by 30% monthly and statically. It didn't change from that point. Because people were engaging with the game on a much deeper level, they saw that there was content. Something to remember for content, toxicity and negative behavior. So you need to try and consider the emotions your game is bringing out in users. And if one of the emotions is the ones on the first point, like frustration, pride, jealousy, rage, humiliation, especially for competitive games, this is the type of stuff that can cost like your studio its existence, straight up. League of Legends is kind of the poster child for this. It didn't cost them their studio, but it did cost them a lot of money to have a community with that issue. But even games like Undertale can create toxic fandoms. So it's not necessarily because your game does it by default. It's trying to figure out what's your messaging, what's the experience for players from start to finish. There's a lot behind it. But you need to at least try and figure out if your game experience is causing negative emotions. You can also try to reverse these emotions into their positive variants, but don't try to just negate like trying to filter them is fine, but it doesn't negate the issues. And I think Hearthstone is an excellent example of this. Hearthstone is a competitive card game. I can tell you that people rage on it all the time. And I know that because people try to add me as a friend when I beat them to say something horrible and then leave. But even if I didn't know it, the frustration is stopped because you don't have chat. But then you have this whole subculture as to what every emote means. This is old again, but it kind of gives you an idea. Like basically, the emotes are recoded. Players will reuse the messages that they have in game in order because they're frustrated, in order to share that frustration with their opponent. In a game like Hearthstone, for example, as well, even without those emotes, you could just pass 90 seconds per turn. Just make the experience of the other player worse. So when a player is frustrated, they will use any tool at their disposal to express that frustration, if they have a bad day or if they're an inherently disruptive player. So again, it's why it's important to remove the frustrating elements rather than just trying to obfuscate them. All right. There's one part of this presentation. I know it's been lunch, and I know some people might be tired. It's been a day. But I think that you will all design better games if you have this line in mind. This is the one line I would say is the most important out of the presentation. Because even if it isn't totally accurate or true, having this in mind will lead you to design a better experience, honestly, in general. Now, what do I mean by a spectator is a player without a controller in their hand? By that, I mean, especially with the announcement of, say, Google Stadia that came out, like, we're very close to an era where you watch a game and you can play it right away. So, because of that, somebody watching a game being seconds, if not minutes away, means that they can literally be players. They just haven't played the game. They can be engaged players watching a stream of their favorite game and trying to engage, and then wanting to play the game either at the same time or just after. So always consider the spectator as a player without a controller. Now, once you derive that, it means that if a player is pressing a button and something happens on screen, that makes sense to the player, but maybe not to the person watching. So you need to make sure that if a button's pressed, it does lead to a visible change. Even if it's something like charging an attack, you can clearly see the users charging an attack. Let's say you're developing a console or PC game. you still need to make sure that the visuals, and especially the text, if the text is relevant, is visible on a 7-inch tablet or a 4.7-inch phone. Because people are watching YouTube videos on the bus, on their way to work, on their way back. So, and if it's not legible, they're going to close that video in about 2 seconds. So at that point, that's killing your game's marketing. If somebody makes a Let's Play of your game, but it's not visible on a phone, you're essentially making your marketing worse. At very little cost, you can make the visuals and text much clearer. The person watching doesn't have to get everything, but they have to understand what the core of the game is. And then the last point is much more relevant, especially for games that will work with streams, which is because with a stream, unlike YouTube, you're not going to start at the start. You're going to jump in at any point. So you need to make sure the game state is clear to somebody that does jump in at any point. So try to break down your game experiences into smaller chunks and wonder, if somebody came in 10 minutes down the road, would this still make sense to someone? Can I understand what's going on screen? The first point I would say is not too costly, but make sure that there's an empty space on the screen so that streamer can put their face. Otherwise, they have to do something like put their face over ammunition or radar, and it essentially makes the spectating experience worse. So try to consider a spot on your screen that's empty. Top left or top right are good spots. Essentially, bottom right is usually used up a lot, but the other free spots are fine. Make sure that, throughout the game as well, the same spaces are roughly empty, right? So if you're playing a game and the middle of the screen is usually where the action is, but the sides are not, then make sure the sides stay empty, because obviously if they get filled, say an enemy's coming from the left or right, and that's obfuscated by the streamer's head, then that makes the spectating experience worse. And then finally, if you can create a strong developer-streamer relationship, then you can create a good feedback loop from them. If you can get your streamers to explain what they would like as tools and how they would like your game's design to be improved, then you can make a more robust game as a result for viewing. I have plenty of examples for all this stuff. We use Hearthstone again. I could have used most digital card games today because honestly, there's a lot of good work being done in that space. But it's about, everything here is very clear and visually appealing. And for people who play Hearthstone, I'm very sorry. Those stats are clearly wrong. But yeah, this is very, I get what's going on. Green means I can play the card. The text is very readable on screen. Even if I'm on a phone, I would get this. The one thing that's awful about this is the health. So if you look at the top of the screen, you can essentially see the druid has kind of a 27 with a red mark, so red on red. Please don't do red on red. We can be better at this stuff. Next example is binding of ISAC. Because streamers, depending on their audience, can choose a slightly different experience. So here this streamer is going to appeal to a much newer audience. The UI elements are a lot more barren, so there's much less that my eye has to catch attention to get what's going on. The action's clearly there in front. There's the UI elements I need. So if you've never played this game, it's pretty easy to understand what's going on. But some people want to watch streams that they want to engage with the game on a deeper level. So for those players, you have this option, which is information overload. So you got the mini map that's on top of the items collected, and on the left you have statistics and stuff. So this streamer is clearly not appealing to a newer audience to the game, but they are appealing to people who have played the game for a longer time. And having that variation is really important. And even if your game is in development and you're trying to wonder how you can improve things, I like this example from a local studio in Canada, Quebec as well. So this is the menu image early in development. This is Mages of Australia. And it's not really clear what's going on, but try to imagine this on a phone. The left side might be understandable, but the right side is going to be gibberish mess. If you were to watch this game on a phone, it'd be almost impossible to understand what's going on. But again, later on, this is the actual menu that came out when the game was launched. It's way clearer. The text is still a little difficult to parse, so I would still improve on that. But there's much less information my eye has to capture. So I still get the spell crafting element because of spells on the top left, the fact that you can essentially choose your orbs. So if you're watching a video, you can see those move. And you clearly get groups. So with grouping, you get to choose a class of spell, which essentially from that point tells you, it gives you at least some information as to what's going on. So this is already, but again, this was from early development to later development. So it's quite possible to make that experience better for spectators. Right. And finally, it's always, in my view, it's always time to experiment. Always time to try different things. I wanted to go back on the editor side of things because I said that it would be good to have a way to capture images, videos, etc. But honestly, have that stuff in game. Like, have an editor in game. Have a way for someone to be able to remove the UI. And if you want a perfect example as to a game design that matches this, there was a game I saw a while back. The name escapes me. But it was from an Austrian studio. And essentially, it was a racing game with an exploration element in space. So there were two kind of design constraints in there. There was the exploration in space, so trying to find out what was going on, being able to go off course, and then there was the race element, essentially following, trying to win a race. But what's interesting with that is when you're capturing an image of the race experience, you want the UI. You want the speed, you want the position of the player, you want to understand the map. Like, those elements are important to a racing experience. But if the person's exploring space, you don't want those elements. It's not important. What's important is the beautiful vistas you're exploring. At that point, you want to mask the UI. So by allowing the player to have a tool to mask the UI, you allow those players to engage with the experience they want to within your game. The more options you can give inside, the better. Plus, the advantage of having these editors in-game is that you can, while the player is still the one creating the content, you are kind of pushing the right branding, so to speak. You make sure your game looks as sleek as it can be. And if you want a marketing example as to why you should do this, Rocket League did pretty well off being GIFable. GIFable is probably not a verb on a dictionary, but that's fine. I think you understand it. But yeah, part was it that they were featured as a free game on the PlayStation, but honestly, the second part was that Reddit exploded because GIFs were super easy to make for that game. And that was a huge boost to its marketing. Collaboration. This actually came from observing games in the South Asia market. A lot of the game developers in that region will collaborate with each other more than we tend to see in the Western markets. Even in the same space. There was an example of two companies working together on creating content, and they were both Japanese MMOs. Like, they literally hit the same market, but they were still creating content together because they saw it as an added value to their players. They saw it as, anyways, our players are not going to migrate from one game to the other because of the deep commitment, so we're just going to work together on creating content. We don't do enough collaboration. And a lot of studios have very limited IP. Even big ones have one or two key pieces of IP, and they're struggling to create a third, or a second, actually, for that matter. Indie studios usually have, again, one or two pieces of IP. So one way to create more value for players and give them a better experience is to create, essentially find a studio that has similar brand values to the ones you're espousing, and share assets. Create have bonus characters in each other's games. Have a one-off event, an additional level. Whatever makes sense, right? And that can increase, essentially, the attention to your game from another audience. If you want an example that's relatively new, Shovel Knight synergized a lot with Nintendo to get into Smash Brothers, and that does add up. Smash Brothers is an incredibly popular game, so Shovel Knight getting into it does get it more attention. You could argue that Shovel Knight got its attention first anyway, so it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. But if you also, another good collaboration technique that happened a lot in Montreal was for Kickstarters. So if you kickstarted one game, you'd get a copy of a game that another developer made. So it was a way to give players immediate value upon supporting a new project. So if somebody follows a developer with only 2 or 3 titles, that way they're getting more titles than just those 2 or 3. these are last tips. So there's a lot of content in there, and it kind of applied to all games to a degree, but every game will, like every game you're designing or developing will use different elements. These three, I would say, are universal across almost all titles. Make sure you have a way to communicate in-game with a specific player, a group, or category of players, or all of them at once. I cannot stress how important that is. It doesn't look important, but it doesn't take much time to develop. And trust me when I say that it will give you all the value you ever want. It's super important. Have your bug reporting tool in-game, because the last thing you want is for somebody that went through the effort of finding a bug in your game, having to go on top of that outside, having to create a forum account, and then having to give you imperfect information on that bug. If they report it in-game, you get way better information, the feedback's immediate, and you know which player did it in-game, so you can use the first tool. You can talk back to that player to say, your bug was fixed, thank you, and maybe give them a little present. And then, again, the last element, having a personalized way to recap the player's journey. Think about this as the selfie effect, right? We live in a world where selfies are popular, but the reason for that is because we've kind of photographed and videoed a lot of what exists out there. But a way that people have found to get more enjoyment is to match themselves with different elements. Think about this as like the Eiffel Tower selfie effect. People take pictures of the Eiffel Tower, but what's prized today is taking a photo of yourself in front of it. So think about that element as the player went through an experience that everybody shared, but their journey specifically was probably different to someone else's. So at that point, you need to find a way to recap that player's journey in a personalized fashion. That's kind of it for the presentation itself. My email, my Twitter, the website, towards the bottom will have this presentation and all its slides. You can avoid the self-promotion dross. I think it's terrible, but at least the presentations are there. There's also a follow-up to it that looks more into basically how to incite content creation and cases of toxicity, specifically League of Legends and Undertale in there, that you can look at if you want additional content. I guess there's some time for questions, so I will open it to that. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Where did you make your presentation? I really love your transitions from slide to slide.
Oh, sure. The tool itself. The tool is Prezi. So I'll sell it a bit, but basically it's a cloud-based presentation tool. I use it because I wanted my presentations to be publicly available, and it was a way to have them cloud saved so I don't have to send files to people. I can just send a URL. So because I'm a consultant slash, mostly changing the consultant strategist, to be honest with you, but one of the things that's important is to showcase some of your work. So I just send a URL rather than a 2 meg PowerPoint.
Actually, I also use Prezi sometimes. I think it's a startup from Hungary, if I'm not mistaken.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, it's great. I've been using it for years. So.
Any more questions? Maybe related to the presentation? The content, I mean.
Well, we're getting the microphone over there. I'm also available for like the next half hour just outside. So if you have any questions you want to ask in private, no problem.
Yeah, regarding one of the last tips you gave us, can you give us some examples of how the game can communicate with players or player groups, or what is the good way to do that?
Sure, okay. So if you were talking to a specific player, that's just the ability to message them. Again, the bug reporting. So like if a player reports a bug and they were unique in them, let's say an exploit, them doing it in private is super good for the developers. So in that case, you would be able to thank the player privately and maybe give them a gift. For a group of players, it might be every player that has a specific item or has completed a specific task, so you can message them all with the same message, essentially, like well done or whatever makes sense. And for all players, I worked on basically a web strategy game before mobile games were, it was like a precursor to a lot of what mobile games became. But one of the important things that made our events resonate so much was using what we used before for sales as the world chat tool. We instead changed sales to events. And then we had our items match the event anyway. So by messaging that the event was happening, the number of players in events went from about 20-ish% of the player base to about 50 to 60%. So like just by because players are in game, right? They're not also always checking their Facebook, Twitter for your channel or WhatsApp, whatever makes sense. So at that point, being able to, they're always in game though. So when you message them in game, you get a much higher impact. So those are kind of free examples for all of those. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Applause.
Yep.